Good evening. I'm Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's event. Before I introduce our student who will introduce Professor Foner, I'd like to thank the Department of History at the University of Richmond, the University of Richmond School of Law, and our colleagues at Style Weekly. All of them are co-sponsoring this wonderful series that we've been able to offer this year. And now I'd like to introduce Allie Grogan. She's a senior at the University of Richmond who is majoring in leadership studies with a minor in business administration. Like many of our students at the university, perhaps all of them, she's extremely busy in other dimensions as well. She's a senator on the West Hampton College Student Government Association. She works as a consultant with our speech center at the University of Richmond. She's a new member director of her sorority, Kappa Alpha Theta, and she's the business manager of her co-ed a cappella group, Cœur du Roi. Please help me in welcoming and thank in advance Allie Grogan for introducing our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Dean Peart, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. I'm honored to introduce one of our country's most prominent historians, Dr. Eric Foner, tonight to speak at our Jepson Leadership Forum. Dr. Foner is the DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University and is one of two people to have served as president of the Organization for American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Society of American Historians. Dr. Foner studies the intersections of intellectual, political, and social history, as well as the history of American race relations. His book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877, won the Bancroft Prize, the Parkman Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Award, just to name a few. A 1988 New York Times book review of Dr. Foner's Reconstruction reads, "And with this book, Mr. Foner becomes the preeminent historian of Reconstruction." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Foner.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here in Richmond to talk to you about Reconstruction. When I'm finished, we will have time for questions or comments. There are going to be a couple of microphones for that set up on the edges of the room. So please feel free, after I'm finished, to raise any questions that you might be interested in. Reconstruction is both a specific time period of American history, although the exact designation of it is somewhat uncertain. Usually it's been dated 1865, when the Civil War ended, to 1877, when the Hayes-Tilden Compromise sort of ended the prospect of national intervention in the South to protect the rights of the former slaves. My book actually started Reconstruction in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Today, today's scholarship on Reconstruction has been expanding the other way. Scholars talk about a long Reconstruction going to maybe 1890 or 1900. I don't know, but it's a specific time period, but maybe even more interestingly, Reconstruction is also a historical process. It's the process by which the United States tried to come to terms with the two great consequences of the American Civil War, one being the consolidation of national power and national unity, and the second, the destruction of the institution of slavery. One might say that in that sense, we are still living with Reconstruction in a way. We are still trying to come to terms with exactly what the balance of power is between the federal government and the states, and we are still trying to deal with the legacy of slavery in America. Now, I have devoted a lot of my career to Reconstruction. In fact, one of the things I've done, back in the 1990s, I curated a museum exhibition which began here in Richmond at the Virginia Historical Society about Reconstruction and then traveled to a number of venues around the country. And I've written about Reconstruction, but I have to acknowledge that rather few Americans know very much about Reconstruction. Back in the 1990s, the Department of Education did one of these surveys of graduating seniors from American high schools, about 16,000 of them, to find out what they knew about American history. And they asked them to sort of identify or say something about a whole bunch of things. So most of them could identify, let's say, the dropping of the first atomic bomb or the civil rights movement. But at the bottom of the list, the lowest point, was Reconstruction. Only 20% of these graduating seniors could say anything intelligible about Reconstruction. Since I had just published a 600-page book on Reconstruction, I found this disheartening. But the fact is that even if we're not aware of it, Reconstruction is part of our lives today in the United States, because many of the issues facing American society are Reconstruction issues. That doesn't mean that Reconstruction gave us the answers, but they put those issues, Reconstruction put these issues on the national agenda. Here's a fact about American history that is a little more substantive to show you why Reconstruction is worth studying. Everybody knows that Barack Obama is the first African-American president of the United States, 1 out of 44 presidents. Fewer people probably can tell you how many African Americans have served in the United States Senate over the course of our career, of our history. I won't make this a question period like in law school where you point someone out and say, how many blacks have been in the Senate? The answer is actually 9, or maybe 10, because Kamala Harris, who was just elected from California, I think has, I'm not quite sure what her ethnicity is, but anyway, there have certainly been 9, including President Obama when he was in the Senate. But there have been like over 2,000 senators. So 9 out of 2,000 is a much worse percentage than 1 out of 44. But 2 of those black senators served during Reconstruction, both from Mississippi, Hiram Revels, the first African-American in the U.S. Senate, and Blanche K. Bruce after him, which shows you that Reconstruction was a rather unique moment in terms of political democracy and the rights, the political rights of African-American people in the long sweep of American history. Now, even though, as I say, we may not know that much about Reconstruction, it is part of our lives. Issues that are on our agenda today, as I said, are Reconstruction issues. Who is entitled to American citizenship? That is a Reconstruction question. It's being debated right now. What are the rights of citizens? Who is responsible for protecting them? Is it the federal government, the state governments? That's a Reconstruction question. What is the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom? Political rights, economic rights, that's a Reconstruction question. Terrorism is a Reconstruction question. The first large-scale experience of terrorism in American history took place in Reconstruction. It was not foreign-inspired terrorism, it was homegrown. It was the Ku Klux Klan and kindred organizations which used violence, terror, murder, etc., to try to attain political ends. One could go further and further, but my point is you can't really understand American history or our society today without knowing something about Reconstruction. Now, in her memoirs, published in the 1890s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the pioneer advocate of women's rights, recalled that Reconstruction, she wrote, quote, involved the reconsideration of the principles of our government and the natural rights of man. The nation's heart was thrilled with prolonged debates in Congress and state legislatures, in the pulpits, in the public journals, at every fireside on these vital questions. So this was a period where the fundamental nature of our society, of our democracy, was debated at all levels of society, as Stanton says, in Congress and at people's firesides. One other thing, before I get into the actual history of the period, Reconstruction is a prime example of what we might call the politics of history. I'm not talking about whether a historian is a Democrat or a Republican. What I mean by that is the way in which historical interpretation both reflects and helps to shape the moment in which the historian is writing. As many of you know, I'm sure, for many years, really most of the 20th century, what we call the old or standard or Dunning School view of Reconstruction, named after William Dunning, one of my predecessor long ago as a professor of Civil War era history at Columbia University. This view dominated historical writing, textbooks, and popular thinking. And in a very brief nutshell, it argued that Reconstruction after the Civil War was the lowest point in the saga of American history. It was a period of corruption, misgovernment, a giant mistake. In this view, President Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the Civil War, wanted to bring the defeated South back into the Union in as lenient a manner as possible. After his assassination, his policy was, according to this view, continued by his successor, President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was thwarted by the villains of the peace, the radical Republicans in Congress, motivated either by just vindictiveness toward the South or, in some views, the desire to fasten the rule of Northern capitalism on the South. They overthrew Lincoln and Johnson's plan and imposed black suffrage, for men anyway, the right of black men, for the first time in American history really, to vote in the South. The problem was, according to this view, that black people are inherently incapable of taking part in political democracy. They just are genetically incapable of doing that. And therefore, what happened was this orgy of corruption and misgovernment presided over by this sort of trio of carpetbaggers, that is, Northerners who'd come down to the South, scalawags, who were white Southerners who cooperated with these new regimes, and the blacks themselves. Eventually, according to this old view, patriotic groups like the Klan and others overthrew these Reconstruction governments and restored what was politely called home rule, or what we would really want to call white supremacy, in these southern states. Now, what do I mean by the politics of history? This interpretation had an amazing longevity. We historians make our living revising what previous historians have written. That's our job. And indeed, I'm sorry to say, I'm sure there are even young historians today revising what I have written about Reconstruction in a misguided manner. To remain the standard view for 50, 60 years, really from 1900 into the Civil Rights era, is quite unprecedented. I can't think of any other interpretation of American history that remained dominant for so long. So what explains that? What explains the longevity of this Dunning School older view of Reconstruction? What explains it is it was congruent with and indeed legitimized the racial system we call Jim Crow that lasted from the turn of the century to the mid-1960s. Because this old view of Reconstruction had very clear political implications, lessons. One, it was a mistake to give the right to vote to black men in the South. Therefore, the white South was justified in taking the right to vote away, which every state did between 1890 and around 1906. And if you gave the right to vote back to black people, the horrors of Reconstruction would be revisited. Secondly, Reconstruction was imposed on the South by Northerners. Maybe even some of them were well-meaning, motivated, do-gooders, but the horrors of Reconstruction allegedly showed that only white Southerners really understand race relations in the South. People should not listen to outside pressures for change in the southern states. And finally, this is rather arcane today, this view of Reconstruction was a bulwark of what used to be the solid democratic South, because Reconstruction was created by the Republican Party. And if Southerners began to vote Republican, you would again get a rehearsal or a reliving of Reconstruction. So that was the politics of the old view. When the Civil Rights Movement came along, the entire edifice of this view fell to the ground, because it was based on this notion of black incapacity, that it was correct to exclude African Americans from participation in American democracy. Once it became clear that that assumption was illegitimate, the entire edifice interpretation became, unconvincing. And historians went through a long period of emphasizing the positive achievements of Reconstruction, and basically came to the view that the problem with Reconstruction was not that it was attempted, but that it failed, and therefore left to future generations this difficult problem of racial justice in American society. Now, I should say also, of course, that this view of Reconstruction achieved widespread acceptance, not just through the writings of William A. Dunning and his students at Columbia University, but through, for example, the film, many of you are familiar with, The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's great film, which the second half, it takes place in Reconstruction. It's a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. Or the great bestseller of the 1920s, The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers. Bowers was a Democratic Party newspaper man in Indiana. He wrote this book in 1929. Why? Because in 1928, for the first time, a Republican presidential candidate had carried several southern states. Herbert Hoover carried several, first time since Reconstruction, because there were many Southerners who didn't want to vote for Al Smith, the Democratic candidate, as a Roman Catholic. And Bowers was so alarmed by this that he wrote this lurid and really totally imaginative but very influential book about Reconstruction, again warning what would happen if white Southerners continued to vote for Republicans, as they had in 1928. Well, anyway, to understand where Reconstruction came from, of course, you have to go back. I'm not going to go through all of American history, but just to remind ourselves that on the eve of the Civil War, of course, there were 4 million African-American slaves in this country. There were also 500,000 free blacks, North and South. But even the free had very few rights. The Supreme Court in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, had declared that no black person, slave or free, could be a citizen of the United States. Citizenship was just for white people only. Only 5 northern states, basically in New England, with minuscule black populations, allowed black people to vote. Many northern as well as the southern states discriminated in numerous ways about against African Americans. What changed all this, of course, was the Civil War and emancipation. And particularly, I just want to direct attention to the service of 200,000 black men in the Union Army and Navy in the second half of the Civil War. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, not only declared most of the slaves, not all, but most of them free, but authorized for the first time the enrollment of black men in the Union Army. And by fighting and dying for the Union, these soldiers had sort of staked a claim to citizenship. The issue of black citizenship was on the national agenda when the Civil War ended, and even Lincoln himself, who shared some, at least, of the racial prejudices of his era, in his last speech, right before his assassination, had said that he thought in Reconstruction some African-American men ought to have the right to vote, and he singled out what he called the very intelligent, that those being the free blacks, particularly in a place like New Orleans, but also he said those who serve our cause, who have served in our ranks as soldiers. The soldiers had earned the right to vote. This was not universal manhood suffrage, but by this point, Lincoln is way ahead of the curve of Northern public sentiment. Well, Lincoln, of course, is assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, I believe, has a strong claim to being the worst president in American history, although there are other contenders for that rank. Johnson was the opposite of Lincoln. He lacked all of Lincoln's qualities of greatness. He was deeply racist, he was stubborn, inflexible, was incapable of learning or changing his views. He had no connection really with Congress, none with the Republican Party, could not get along with others. And basically his view was the slaves, now free, should just go to work, back out to work on the plantations and have nothing to do with political life. And Johnson set up new governments in the South in 1865, controlled completely by whites, and to bring them back into the Union. These governments quickly passed a series of laws called the Black Codes to regulate the now free black population. They recognized certain rights, like the right to own property or the right to have their marriages, recognized in law, which was not the case under slavery. But they also tried to use the law to force African Americans back to work on the plantations. They made it a crime for a black person to fail to sign a year-long labor contract with a white employer. And if you didn't do that, you could be arrested, fined. If you couldn't pay the fine, you would be basically leased out to a white employer who would pay your fine and have to work for him for the whole year. The point of these black codes is not that they were effective, because they were quickly invalidated in many ways by the Freedmen's Bureau, et cetera, but they turned Northern public opinion against Johnson's policy. It seemed like the Southern states were trying to reinstate or reestablish virtual slavery again in the South. They alarmed the Republican Party, which controlled Congress in the North, and very quickly Congress, in early 1866, decided that Johnson's plan needed to be amended. They wanted to work with Johnson, but they felt the Southern states must be required to recognize the basic rights of the former slaves. And to do that, they enacted, over Johnson's veto, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, one of the most important laws in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, number one, it was the first law to state who is a citizen of the United States and what basic rights all citizens ought to enjoy. First of all, it states the principle we call now birthright citizenship. Anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. It doesn't matter who your parents are, it doesn't matter what religion they are, what race they are, where they came from, how they got here. A person born in the United States is a citizen. This is a statement that anybody of any background can be a good American if they grow up here and they, learn the values of the country, et cetera. It overturns the Dred Scott decision, which said only white people can be citizens. But then it goes on to say that there can't be one set of laws for black people and one set of laws for whites on basic issues. These are what we call the rights of free labor, the right to own property, sign a contract, go to court, sue and be sued, enjoy the equal protection of the laws. No state can discriminate among citizens in that way. In fact, the language they use is kind of interesting. They list these basic rights, and then they say, all citizens must enjoy these rights the same as a white person. Interesting to say that. Because before the war, the word white was used as an exclusion. When they put in, let's say, white men can vote, that's to exclude others. Here, the concept of whiteness is used as an inclusionary thing. If white people have a certain set of rights, everyone else has to enjoy those rights also. Equality before the law. Now, there was nothing about the right to vote in the Civil Rights Bill. That is a political right, not a civil right. But the Civil Rights Bill basically created the concept in our law today, which is still here today, of course, of equality of all citizens before the law. But of course, a law can be repealed by the next Congress, and so very quickly, Congress decided to write these principles into the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, had abolished slavery, irrevocably abolished slavery. And interestingly, the Civil Rights Act was passed under the 13th Amendment. It was the 13th Amendment they cited as the justification. That law was basically a definition of freedom. Slaves are free. Now, what does it mean to be a free person in America? That was what gave them the authorization to pass the Civil Rights Act. But the 14th Amendment, the most important change in our Constitution since the Bill of Rights, put into the Constitution this notion of birthright citizenship, it's in there again, and what it's called equal protection. No state can deprive any citizen of the equal protection of the laws or of due process of law, etc. The law should apply equally to everybody. The word equal is not in the original Constitution, except in a phrase having to do with the number of senators that each state has, an equal number, 2. But that's not what we generally mean when we talk about equality. It's the 14th Amendment that introduces into the Constitution this principle of equality and makes the Constitution what it has become in the 20th and 21st centuries, a vehicle to which aggrieved groups, aggrieved people can appeal if they feel their rights are being violated. And of course, this says nothing actually about race. What was mostly on their mind was the status of the former slaves, but that is not in there. And of course, lately it has been used by all sorts of groups, most famously a couple of years ago in the decision making it illegal for states to deny gay Americans the right of marriage. That's a 14th Amendment decision under the Equal Protection Clause. Obviously, the people writing the 14th Amendment in 1866 were not thinking about gay marriage. That was not on the political agenda. But the principle of equality is expansionary, and that's what Justice Kennedy said when he wrote that opinion. He said, you know, what liberty and equality mean today are not the same thing as what they meant in 1866, but the principle is the same. The 14th Amendment also marks a very significant change in the federal system, that is, the relationship between the national government and the states. The Civil War had crystallized in the minds of Northerners the idea of a powerful national state protecting the rights of citizens. This principle put into the Constitution, again, made a radical change in our political system. You can see my point if we compare the 14th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. What are the first words of the First Amendment, which talks about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion? Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech. The Bill of Rights was meant to restrain the federal government, because at that time the idea was the greatest danger to liberty is a too powerful national government. But now, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, which will come soon, they all end with a clause saying Congress shall have the power to enforce this. Congress shall make no law versus Congress shall have the power. This is a fundamental shift in the power relations between the federal governments and the state. Now the federal government becomes what Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, called the custodian of freedom. Slavery had been created by state law. It was the states which had passed the black codes. States had made it clear that they could not be trusted to actually protect the rights of all Americans. So the 14th Amendment now makes it the federal government's responsibility to oversee what the states are doing in this realm of the equality of citizens. Now, the 14th Amendment also said nothing about the right to vote, except in a convoluted clause which was meant to deny the southern states some of their representation if they did not give blacks the right to vote, but it left the right to vote in the hands of the individual states where it had always been. But Very quickly, Congress decided that Johnson's governments were too discriminatory, too unequal, and had to be replaced. And in 1867, they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which says we got to have new governments in the southern states, and they will be based on manhood suffrage. Women, unfortunately, did not have the right to vote anywhere in these years, but henceforth, it said in the southern governments, black men should now have the right to elect members of legislatures, Congress, constitutional conventions, etc. And then shortly thereafter, the 15th Amendment tried to protect the right to vote of black men throughout the country. But the 15th Amendment was a weaker amendment than the 14th because it was couched negatively. It said no state can deprive anybody of the right to vote because of race. No state can deprive you of the right to vote because of race. What's wrong with that? It says you can't discriminate against black people because in the right to vote. Well, the problem, the radical Republicans wanted a positive amendment saying any male citizen 21 years of age or over has the right to vote. What's the difference between that and the negative? No state can deprive a person of the right to vote on the basis of race. The problem is the 15th Amendment left open many other ways of limiting the right to vote, such as property qualifications or literacy tests or understanding clauses or poll taxes, as long as they weren't racially defined, as long as they applied to everybody. But later on, of course, southern states would use those methods in order to basically eliminate the black vote in the South. We are still debating, I don't need to tell you, who should have the right to vote, what qualifications you should have the right to vote. These are all 15th Amendment questions. Voter suppression, ID laws, all that kind of thing arises out of the 15th Amendment. And, as I say, is another Reconstruction issue still on our agenda. Now, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 inaugurated the period we call radical Reconstruction. New governments controlled by the Republican Party came to power in every southern state, and for the first time in American history, African Americans enjoyed genuine political power. They did not dominate the South. The old lurid tales of black supremacy, blacks running amok, are completely false. But for the first time, you had genuine political democracy in the South. As I said, 2 black men served in the Senate, about 16 in the House of Representatives. You had African Americans at every level of political life, from local justices of the peace and sheriffs up to school board officials, members of the legislature, state officials, et cetera, et cetera. That's why W.B. Du Bois, in his great book from many, many years ago, the 1930s, Black Reconstruction in America, his subtitle, I don't have the exact wording, it's a long subtitle, but it says it's a story of the effort to create democracy in the United States. That's the number one thing to remember about Reconstruction. It was the first time that we had an interracial democracy in the United States, 80 or 90 years after the American Revolution. And these governments had significant achievements. The most important was they established the first publicly funded common school systems in the southern states. There had not been these school systems for all children before the war, and these Reconstruction governments created them. They attempted to rebuild the South economically. Reconstruction was a remarkable experiment in democracy, but of course, the problems of the former slaves coming out of slavery were not limited to civil rights and political rights. They came out of slavery with no economic wherewithal. In early 1865, in January, soon after capturing the city of Savannah after his march to the sea, General William T. Sherman met in Savannah with a group of local black ministers, 18 or 19 of them, and for what we call a colloquy. Luckily, there was an Army stenographer present, so we have a record of the discussion. Sherman asked them, how do you define slavery? How do you understand slavery? And the spokesman of these black ministers said, well, slavery is enjoying the fruits of another man's labor without his permission. Slavery is the theft of labor. What's interesting is that is what Lincoln said slavery was. There are many ways you can attack slavery, but Lincoln said slavery is the theft of labor. Everybody is entitled to the fruits of his own labor. A slave does not enjoy that basic natural right. Then Sherman said, well, how can you enjoy freedom? And he said, and the minister said, well, give us land. Give us land. We can create communities of our own. We can live without being dominated by white people. Give us land, and we can work by ourselves and enjoy the fruits of our labor. Sherman said, that's a great idea. Actually, he didn't say that, but he should have said it. But what he did was issue Special Field Order number 15, which set aside a big swath of land on the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia for the exclusive settlement of black families in 40-acre plots of land. And he also said, look, the Army, we've on a big march, we got hundreds and hundreds of mules. They're kind of broken down. If you want a mule, we'll give you a mule too. This is the origin of the phrase 40 acres and a mule, Sherman's order. Even people who know nothing about Reconstruction have heard about 40 acres and a mule because it's the name of Spike Lee's film company. But it's used as a shorthand for the desire throughout the South of former slaves for land. Now, of course, it didn't happen. Land distribution did not happen. Andrew Johnson ordered this land returned to the former owners. He ordered other land that the Freedmen's Bureau had taken charge of returned to the owners. So black people came out of slavery with political rights, but still with little option other than to go back to work for white employers because they had not been given the economic wherewithal that they desired. One might almost say in Reconstruction, the political revolution went forward very dramatically, but the economic revolution did not. But the political revolution was dramatic enough that it inspired, as I mentioned, a wave of violence in the South, terrorism, Ku Klux Klan, and kindred groups, which was successful in some places in paralyzing these new governments and eventually helping to overthrow at least some of them. Each state has its own particular history, but the Klan was very effective in some states in making Reconstruction impossible, making the success impossible. At first, President Grant, who succeeded Andrew Johnson after the election of 1868, moved vigorously to suppress the Klan. In 1871, he sent troops into South Carolina, federal marshals into Alabama, rounded up Klan leaders, put them on trial, and did succeed in restoring tranquility in most of the South in the early 1870s. But by the mid-70s, as Northern commitment to Reconstruction was waning, violence again reared its head, and the Grant administration did not intervene, and one by one, the last of the Deep South southern states, Reconstruction was overthrown, and white supremacist Democrats came back into power. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, another generation took place before the new system, which is called in a shorthand Jim Crow, was fastened upon the South. There was a kind of intermediary period in the 1880s where some rights were taken away, but many still continued. There were still black members of Congress. There was still black voting. Virginia had what some people called a second Reconstruction between 1879 and 82 or 83 under the readjusters who came to power partly having to do with the state debt, but with black votes and white votes, reinstated a kind of Reconstruction government, which was overthrown in 1883. A similar thing happened in North Carolina in the 1890s. In 1894, a coalition of black Republicans and white populists gained control of North Carolina and introduced what you might call a second Reconstruction of North Carolina. It wasn't until the right to vote was rescinded, basically, from African Americans that those kinds of insurgencies really became impossible, and that by the early 20th century, this, what we know as the system of Jim Crow, of segregation, disenfranchisement, and many, many other forms of inequality was sort of fastened upon the South. But this, of course, was a regional system. In the South, the 14th and 15th Amendments became dead letters for a long time, but in the rest of the country, they still existed. There was deep discrimination in the rest of the country, but as African Americans began to move in the 20th century from the South to the North, they began to regain political influence and organize politically, but that is, of course, a long and very different story. I'm just about out of time, but I just wanted to raise a couple of lessons, you might almost say, that we might think about today. What does this story of Reconstruction tell us? Well, one is that rights on the books are not sufficient. Or that is to say, our rights are not self-enforcing. The 14th Amendment remained part of the Constitution, but it was ignored for many, many years, with the acquiescence of the North and the Supreme Court. The Civil Rights Law of 1866 is still on the books, but for many, many years it was not enforced. In other words, as an old phrase goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. But the fact that those measures were enacted during Reconstruction, and by the way, that was probably the only moment in American history when they could have been enacted. I don't think if the 14th Amendment were not part of the Constitution, you could have it ratified today by 3/4 of the states and 2/3 of Congress. But the fact that they were there, they were what Sumner called sleeping giants in the Constitution. They could be reawakened as they were in the 1960s by a wholly different generation. You know, when South Africa abolished apartheid, they had to write a whole new constitution. They had an apartheid constitution. But the civil rights movement in the United States did not produce any change in the Constitution. What they were demanding was not a new Constitution, but that the Constitution we already had be enforced, which it had not been for 70 or 80 years. So one other final point. We Americans sort of like to think of our history as a sort of straight line development of greater and greater freedom. Yes, everybody will acknowledge we had slavery at the beginning, at the time of our revolution. After a bloody war, slavery was abolished. We had segregation. We had the civil rights. But there's a kind of upward trend of greater and greater freedom, greater and greater rights. But I think as Reconstruction and some other aspects of our history show, our history is more complicated than that and maybe more interesting. It's a history of ups and downs. It's a history of progress and retrogression, of rights gained and rights lost or taken away. During the Civil War, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist from Massachusetts who was the commander of one of the first black units, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, he wrote, "Revolutions may go backward." Reconstruction was a revolution that went backward. But the fact that it happened at all laid the foundation for later generations of black and white people to struggle to bring to fruition the aspiration for a society in which the tyranny of race has been put behind us. We might today be looking at another period of when rights gained are restricted or taken away. It's not at all impossible. We've come very far as a country, I think, in the last half century, but the challenge of that Reconstruction tried to face, the challenge of dealing with the legacy of slavery, the challenge of creating a truly multiracial democracy in this country, in many ways still confronts us 150 years after Reconstruction. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, this gentleman, as you see, is putting 2 microphones out here, 1 in each aisle. And I invite anybody who has a question or a comment to please step to one of those mics, just so everyone else in the audience can hear you. Yes.
I wanted to make this forum because after reading Leonard Pitt's Free Man, and then noticing in the back that he consulted with Leon Litwick on the Reconstruction.
Right.
And you answered my question or confirmed my feelings from the first statement you made, and that was the vestiges are still very strong in our society as a result of or caused by Reconstruction. The voters' rights bill being turned back. Looking at the past, look toward the future and give me your ideas as to...
The future.
You might can do a little bit on the last week's election, but I'll let it be in your charge.
Well, we historians have enough trouble figuring out what happened in the past than to speculate on what may happen in the future. And it's, honestly, it is really too soon to tell what the full consequences of the election will be. I honestly can't say at all I think future historians will have a field day looking at this election and whatever the Trump administration, does end up doing. I do think, and I'm not here retroactively to ask people to vote for any candidate, I do think one of the worrying things right this minute, and we'll see what happens, is what you might call the normalization of a certain kind of white supremacist rhetoric that was out there in the in the campaign to some extent, and is now going to be in the White House with this fellow Bannon, who is going to be his chief strategist and everything. That I do think that this kind of what they call white nationalism or anything is a dangerous outlook. And we have seen in other countries some of the dire consequences that can come from this very, very restrictive kind of vision of what a country is or who can be a member of the society and who can't. And as I say, it's become a little more normalized or naturalized. It's just another view out there. So, okay, this guy believes in Social Security reform, and this guy believes in white supremacy. And, what the heck, it's just another political view. So, but we will see what happens. One thing I can say as a New Yorker, Trump has been, we've seen Trump on the front page of our tabloids for like 30 years, and we're tired of him. I'm happy he's moving to Washington in some sense, get him out of New York. But one thing I will say is he's completely unpredictable, judging from his record in New York in the last 30 years, and that makes it even more impossible to predict what he might want to do. So I'm afraid I really can't get too much into speculation about the future. Okay, let's see, sir.
Hi, my name's Kurt Fritz. Howard Zinn writes about, in an effort to kind of show really just how much blacks in America did not like slavery, talks about the amount of slave rebellions and resistance to slavery in order to do away with any kind of myth that they were complicit in this behavior. In your book, you talk about how as southern cities are taken over, more and more blacks will join Union troops and take up guns. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned violence a few times in talking about that, and it feels like we're living in a bit of a powder keg now. How much was white fear of violence illegitimate, which I think we hopefully acknowledge and know, but how much of it might have been legitimate? There's a documentary out right now called The 13th that's talking about white fear and really creating the mass incarceration that we have. But I wanted to see from a historical perspective your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, thank you. the Old South, there was a lot of fear of possible slave violence, insurrection. In the Old South, the example of Haiti, where slaves rose up and destroyed the system and massacred many, many white people, was well known. That example was a fear in the minds of many people in the South before the Civil War. And there were not a lot of outright slave insurrections in American history. The balance of power within the South was very much against anything like that succeeding. There were many slaves who ran away or tried to run away. My most recent book was about the Underground Railroad, about people who assisted runaway slaves. 200,000 black men joined the Union Army and Navy, as I said. So the idea of black people with guns was very frightening to a lot of white people. And indeed, these black codes I mentioned also included provisions saying no black person could own a gun. In fact, Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court has cited this history to say, that the Second Amendment, that gun control is racist. It has a racist origin, and black people ought to rally around the Second Amendment because gun control has been used to give white people a monopoly of guns, so to speak. That was certainly true in the South right after the Civil War. At least the laws attempted to do that. So there was fear of black violence. There was violence. The South was a very violent place, both under slavery and in Reconstruction. But most of it was the other way. Most of it was white individuals or groups like the Klan. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up after the Civil War to kind of try to regulate the transition from slavery to freedom. They have thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents in the National Archives. One of those that the historians kind of like in a ghoulish way is what we call the Texas Murder Registry. Freedmen's Bureau kept a registry of murders in Texas. Texas is a strange place. I hope I'm not, that is to say, I don't know. They didn't have this in any other state except Texas, this book. But anyway, what it was basically black people being killed by white people in 1866, 1867, and the reason was put down. What was the reason? Failed to tip his hat when I walked by on the sidewalk, Or these were not murders based on some horrible event, action. These were just somebody slightly stepped out of line and a guy pulled out his gun and shot him. Or tried to enter the church, tried to come into the church, that only white people has, or shot him. So there was, the reality was there was far more violence against African Americans, but there were some who advocated self-defense, who tried to get guns. And, the Klan operated in these counties where there was a majority of whites or more or less even population. They didn't operate in the low country of South Carolina, where you have 85% black, because they were armed also. This is a subject which needs more study, I guess. That's the other way historians avoid questions. First, we won't do that. We do need more study of this. Stephen Hahn actually talks about this in some of his books. But the main point is that slavery was itself a system of systematic violence. That was the fundamental institution of violence in the South in the 19th century. Yes?
Thank you, sir, for coming tonight. I guess this is also looking towards lessons, and it occurs to me that after emancipation, the country didn't automatically become a believer in racial equality. There was a lot of racial animus still in the country, and I'm just curious from the mechanics, the politics of it. How did the leaders convince the voters to pursue these policies? How did they speak about it? And what seemed to work just with the mechanics of the politics in keeping interracial coalitions together, and what may have brought them apart?
That's a great question. First of all, the speaker is completely right. Racism was deeply embedded in the society, North and South. It is remarkable that, first of all, the Northern electorate rallied around the 14th Amendment, around the Reconstruction Acts. They were controversial, but the Republicans kept winning significant majorities. Now, not everybody, or I'd say not most of the people in favor, there were abolitionists who were genuine believers in racial equality. But, these issues were tied up with the legacy of the Civil War. And I think a lot of people came to support, let us say, African American suffrage because they felt that was the only alternative to the quote-unquote rebels getting back into power in the South. Andrew Johnson had hoped to empower white yeomen. Andrew Johnson thought that the poorer farmers of the South, white farmers, non-slave owning farmers, were really loyal to the Union. They'd been dragooned into the war by the planters. And at the beginning, he tried to exclude the rich planters from Reconstruction on the assumption that these poorer whites would kind of take power. It didn't happen. They didn't take power. They voted for the old leaders. And that's why Johnson's Reconstruction plan didn't get anywhere. But Republicans looking at that in the North said, well, gee whiz, where else is there a body of loyal and Republican votes in the South? And the only other body was the African American former slaves. So like any congressional action, a measure, the Reconstruction laws, the civil rights laws, that were a combination of idealism, crass partisanship, sectional advantage, all sorts of things went into this. And therefore, many people who were not racial egalitarians at all would support these measures on those other grounds, on partisan grounds, or they just say, we want the results of the Civil War to be guaranteed. We don't want 700,000 people to have died, and suddenly the results of the war are going to be kind of reversed. But of course, as you say, that poses a problem for interracial coalitions. And in the South, it was even more of a problem. In many states, very few whites were willing to join up with these Reconstruction governments. Some states they were. North Carolina, the states where you had significant sections with poor white farmers, the upcountry, the hill country, North Carolina had a very flourishing black-white coalition of black former slaves in the eastern part and white yeoman farmers in the western part who did cooperate. Arkansas, some of these states, Texas for a while. But the states that were really the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, very hard to attract any white people to support these Reconstruction governments, which was a big problem for them. So yes, biracial politics was very difficult, but one can say it's very easy to understand why Reconstruction failed. We could also say it's pretty remarkable that it was attempted at all, given the trajectory of 19th century American history. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could take your kind of politics of history up to contemporary times, because it strikes me that you talked about the 90s and how students didn't know anything. I would argue that's probably still true today, where Reconstruction's at the bottom, right? And that's in contradiction to the fact that there's a historical consensus now, I think, largely around your work and others' work, about how that's wrong, right? The old views are wrong. And a part of me wonders if it's still, because it's bound up in the politics of federalism and contemporary race issues, how much of it's a failure of academia. Akil Amar in his book on the Bill of Rights has a great phrase about, we need to take some weight off the stoop shoulders of Madison and give them to Bingham. I just wonder what your take is on that, for why so many people don't understand the implications of Reconstruction in the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and probably all of the things you mentioned are true. By the way, you can add to it the Supreme Court. I wrote an article somewhere, which they ignored, of course, taking the Supreme Court to task for misunderstanding Reconstruction. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal historian, I'm not saying this case should be decided this way or that way. I looked at their footnotes. It's unbelievable how long Supreme Court justices cited Claude Bowers in footnotes, who is completely discredited among historians. It's built into the jurisprudence, this old view of Reconstruction. Basically, I said these justices should get out more, Instead of just reading past decisions, which are based on a faulty view of history, they should look around them and see what is out there in the society. I don't know if it's true that the Dunning School is really alive that much anymore. I sometimes gauge this by references to Reconstruction by journalists. Up until in the 90s, I remember very well when the Bosnian Civil War was going on, very good reporter for the New York Times wrote, well, I hope at the end of the Bosnian Civil War, the victors don't, act so vindictively toward the losers as the North did toward the South after this. This is the big myth, that it was all vindictiveness. The underlying premise being giving rights to black people is a punishment to white people, which you still hear around sometime. What is the vindictiveness? It is giving rights to the former slaves. But nowadays, when I see references to Reconstruction, it talks about, well, this person is the first African American elected from Alabama since Reconstruction, or the first this since Reconstruction. I think Reconstruction is, at least among those who've gone to college relatively recently, I think the bigger problem is just lack of knowledge altogether. Lack of understanding that Reconstruction is an important moment in our history. Look, it's 150 years ago. It's not, the answers to our current problems are not all embedded in Reconstruction. 40 acres and a mule is not going to be a solution to people's economic problems today, although if you had it in Manhattan, you'd be pretty well off. But, we're a different world, but those abstract issues of equality and rights are still with us, and that's why I think we need to know something about that period. Yes, ma'am.
In your opinion, how, in your definition of Reconstruction, what should be the grounds or the basis of Reconstruction today?
What should be
the grounds or the basis of Reconstruction today?
Interesting. What should be the basis of Reconstruction today? Back in, I guess it was 1993, right, when President Clinton was inaugurated for the first time, The Nation magazine, which I write for sometimes, had an issue asking a bunch of people to write what memos to President Clinton. What should he do? These were not political. These were like an artist, an architect, people who were not political people, and me, a historian. And the only criteria really was there was no chance whatsoever Clinton would listen to us, so we could say whatever we wanted. And my article was called "Time for a Third Reconstruction." So I was trying to anticipate your question. And what I said, which now that I think of it, has a weird resonance right now with the election, was the real issue today is economic inequality. We need a Reconstruction that will look not just at race, but at economic inequality across the board in the country. And that should be the issue for a third Reconstruction. Well, of course, Clinton didn't read The Nation, so he missed out on that. But, and it's obviously still now a bigger issue than ever. But I do think, the country we're not in the same country. The racial template today is completely different. It's no longer just black and white, if it ever was, but it was more so then. We all know the racial, ethnic configuration of the country has changed dramatically. But I do think this question of equal opportunity, of economic, what I said before, the relationship between economic and political democracy should be on our agenda. It has been raised. It was raised by Sanders. It was raised by Trump. And what will happen, I don't know. But, that to me is a fundamental issue facing the country for Reconstruction. Yes, you let this lady respond. Yes.
Do you mean when you say economic equality? Do you mean like wages?
Well, wages are one thing. I think personally, I think if the minimum wage were raised significantly, it would help a heck of a lot of people. But no, I mean, access to jobs, access to good. We are in a society where wages have been frozen for 40 years, basically. Just because of many, many things, the benefits of economic growth are going to the very top 5% of the country. We need some sorts of policies. Now, I'm not a politician. I can't write a bill which will say, but we need awareness of this, that, the benefits of economic growth, economic recovery have been monopolized by a small portion of the population, and there's a lot of resentment about that and anxiety, which has been shown in this election. So I believe maybe because of the election, this is a good moment to try to tackle that question. But there are plenty of other questions, too, and the question of, we all mentioned by a previous speaker of mass incarceration, police behavior. These are all out there. Policing was not a big Reconstruction issue, but, it is today. So we can't just look back to Reconstruction, but, I think a third Reconstruction would be a very good thing. Not that it's likely to happen anytime soon. Yeah.
This question may build on that. You referenced we've gone through a history of progress and retrogression, and you also said that Reconstruction was a revolution that went backward. How does that go forward?
How does that go? Well, in a sense, that's the same question. No, I don't mean to criticize. I just say the first thing is to acknowledge the existence of a problem. I'm not a great man theorist, but I think we need better political leadership than we have had from either party on these fundamental questions. And if our political leaders will acknowledge the existence of some of these problems, then politicians can put their mind to helping to solve them. But, I feel I'm not trying to evade the question. It's not my pay grade to come up with very specific policy plans for the, for the country.
No one's play grade.
All right. Maybe not. But I think recognition of the problem is the number one thing, and let's hope that the current debates and campaign will give us that. So I have the dean is giving me a signal here, which I think means that there is a reception outside. And thank you all. Thank you. Do you want to say that my book is for sale or else? Okay. Since we live in a capitalistic society, the dean will make an announcement.
Please join me once again in thanking Dr. Foner for his wonderful remarks. Before we adjourn, let me say that Dr. Foner will be available to sign his book in the lobby, just behind all of us. And we are having a reception this evening. It'd be wonderful to see all of you there. I should as well say hello to those people who are watching this. We've been streaming it live, so to all of our alumni and our friends to the Jepson School, welcome and thank you for coming. Have a very nice evening.